Hello, here we are still in Frankfurt, Germany, and we're continuing with reading of Mosquito by Rowland White, and we're moving straight on with chapter 4 of part 1. Anders Frederick Emil Victor Schau Lassen hadn't been home to Denmark since May 1939, when the Lassen clan gathered at Bek for the last time. The estate, located near Zealand's east coast, 50 miles south of Copenhagen, had been home to the family since 1929. As boys, he and his brother, Franz, had treated the house and its grounds like an adventure playground, often joined by their German first cousins, Kuno and Axel von den Busch. They camped in the woods, hunting and fishing with guns and knives, but it was the bow and arrow that most spoke to Anders. Inspired by tales of adventure from Denmark's most celebrated hunter, Count Gregers Ahlefeldt, whose collection of trophies at his home in Egeskov Castle was crowned by a world record-breaking pair of impala horns. Anders built his own bow and quickly proved to be an exceptional marksman. It was all a bit much for Inky Wichfeld. Although she and Anders had met as infants, her visit to Bexkov that spring with her mother was the first time she'd been reacquainted with the man he had become. At 17, 2 years younger than Anders, she could hardly fail to notice that he cut a striking figure, but his lithe, blonde good looks failed to compensate for his restlessness and almost feral aggression, nor was she impressed by his ability to shoot gramophone records from the sky like clay pigeons. I much prefer his cousin Axel, she thought, and while Axel might have been more appreciative of Anders' almost uh, preternatural ability with a bow or a throwing knife, he had to agree with Inky that he was a little wild. It was hard to imagine him settling into a quiet life as a very easy burgher of Denmark in peaceful times. But as they parted ways, Axel, already serving as a junior officer in the Wehrmacht, knew that was unlikely. This is the last time we'll meet as a family, he told Anders and Franz, because next year we'll be at war. A year after he'd last seen Axel at Bexkov, Anders was sailing around the tanker Eleonora Maersk off the coast of Oman towards the Persian Gulf when the wireless operator told him that Denmark had been invaded. Forsaking the privilege of his aristocratic upbringing, Anders had gone to sea, signing up as a cabin boy with Denmark's large merchant fleet. But in numerous letters home he made it clear that he thought sailing is shit. Desperate to leave the ship to join what he regarded as the big war, it took 6 months for him finally to persuade the Eleonora Maersk's captain to let him go. After being paid off in Cape Town, he arrived in Oban harbour on Scotland's west coast aboard Mt. British Consul on Christmas Eve 1940. From there he made his way to Newcastle, the city that had become home to the 6,000 Danish seamen who chose not to return to occupied Denmark in April. And while he signed up to Britain's National Union of Seamen as a means of formalising his residency status, he had no intention of going back to sea. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. Rejected by the RAF for his lack of any qualification in maths, however, he was soon presented with an alternative that would prove to be a much more suitable outlet for his rare talent for killing. Ralph Hollingworth travelled to Newcastle in January 1941 to interview potential recruits. A Danish section report explained that Holly was looking for men of good all-round physical standard, particularly if the agent is required to undergo parachute training. Continuing mental alertness and the ability to think clearly are essential, and crucially, any successful candidate needed to speak Danish without any pronounced local accent. He should have a good middle-class background and be a good mixer. Within the rough-hewn working-class community of trawlermen and deckhands, the requirement for finesse somewhat narrowed the field. Holly's task was further complicated by the fact that he couldn't tell the men what they were volunteering for, only that the work would be of vital importance to Denmark and that it would be dangerous. After being recruited by Holly, Anders Lassen couldn't get on the train to London quickly enough, and from there onto the elegant surroundings of Brockhall Hall in Northamptonshire, along with 14 other Danes for 2 weeks of basic training. At no point were they actually told that they were pupils at STS-1, one of SOE's growing portfolio of special training schools. And even as they trained back in 64 Baker Street, Holly still had to try to solve the problem of how he was supposed to get the men enlisted, because Denmark was a German protectorate. Recruiting Danes into the British Army was not straightforward. In the end, Holly's needed to employ men who were officially enemy nationals was dealt with through a quirk of history. The connection between the Royal East Kent Regiment known as the Buffs and the Royal House of Denmark was first established in 1689 with the appointment of Prince George of Denmark as Colonel-in-Chief. The tradition was revived in 1906, and since inheriting the position from his father in 1912, King Christian X of Denmark had embraced the role, granting the unit permission to fly the Danish flag on his birthday and the anniversary of his accession to the throne. It meant that despite Denmark's invidious imposition, if Danish volunteers were drafted into the Buffs, they would legitimately be serving both their regiment's colonel-in-chief and their country's head of state, while not fighting on behalf of Denmark itself. Meanwhile, at Brockhall Hall, where there were the first signs of dissent, an SOE progress report noted that while the Danes at STS-1 were showing great promise, they do not like the idea of what they were regarding as spying. Some, like Lassen, wanted to fight openly for Denmark, not to creep around in the shadows. Then there was Karl Brun, a 37-year-old final-year medical student who somehow combined training for the Special Operations Executive with the completion of his qualification as a surgeon. Despite some time spent with the London University Officer Training Corps, he did not seem, wrote one instructor, to be very military, but Brun, whom Hollingworth had met and recruited through the Danish Council that represented Denmark's diaspora in London, impressed everyone with his intelligence, determination, and quiet confidence. As the basic training at Brockhall came to an end, Brun, Lassen, and the other members of the the first Danish intake signed an oath in pocket Bible in which the undersigned Free Danes in England swore in hand to fight with their allies for Denmark's liberation from foreign yoke. It continued, I hereby swear that I will stay true to my king, Christian X. I also swear that I am ready to serve loyally whatever authority is working against the enemy that occupied my fatherland. By the end of the year, Anders Lassen had been awarded the Military Cross for his part in an operation that helped ensure SOE's survival, and Karl Brun was dead. As SOE struggled to make meaningful inroads on the continent, Lassen's fledgling career within the new organisation also looked to be faltering. His report from STS-1 claimed him to be the weakest character of the party, and that while he is keen enough on the job, he cannot stand being kept in. Incapable of inactivity, he was impatient with a lack of clarity and sense of purpose. 3 weeks of commando training at STS-21 at Arisake House in Inverness provided him with some respite, but with the conclusion of a syllabus that included street fighting, house clearance, demolitions, fieldcraft, sailing, tactics, firearms training, and a course on unarmed close combat and silent killing devised by two tough as gristle former Shanghai policemen, William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes. Anders was soon listless again. It's likely that only an unexpected intervention from Brigadier Colin Gubbins, SOE's hard-charging Chief of Operations, required a man for patrol boat work, and saved him from washing out. Under intense pressure to be seen to be hitting back against the enemy after SOE's inconsequential first year, Gubbins has sanctioned an operation that would serve as a spectacular, if wholly unrepresentative, showcase for his organisation. And while countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Poland had all established national units under British command, Denmark's unique situation meant that Lassen's selection ensured he would perhaps be the first of his countrymen to go into action against the enemy in any capacity at all. On 10th of August 1941, after a slap-up pub lunch, Anders set sail for West Africa from Poole in Dorset as part of the 7-man crew of a wooden Brixham trawler. Still in the cabin were painted murals celebrating Maid Honour's success in the Torbay Regatta. Kept out of sight around her decks were machine guns, 4 powerful spigot mortars of SOE's own design, and a Vickers Mark 8 2-pound cannon. Commandeered earlier in the year, the Maid Honour's unlikely task was to go looking for trouble off the coast of Vichy-controlled West Africa, and if she encountered any U-boats, sink them with the spigot mortars. "We are doomed," Lassen told his crewmates, although he did what he could to prevent it by climbing 60 feet above the deck to nail what he told them was a lucky dolphin tail to the top of one of the boat's 2 masts, and it seemed to do the trick. 5 months later, on an island 20 miles off the coast of Cameroon, Maid Honour's mission would reach its climax in an audacious real-life pirate raid codenamed Operation Postmaster. At midnight, the Maid Honour force slipped into the harbour on the Spanish colony of Fernando Po and made off with 2 large ships from under the noses of their German and Italian crews. The stolen vessels were escorted 400 miles to Lagos by a Royal Navy corvette, claiming to have found them adrift at sea and taken them as legitimate prizes. For the next few months, after most of the Maid Honour crew went on leave to South Africa, Lassen remained in Nigeria, training local troops in guerrilla warfare. In his downtime, he'd head out into the bush to hunt deer, monkeys, crocodiles, birds, and more or less anything unlucky enough to find itself within the range of his Colt 45, but it wasn't to last. After returning to the UK in April, Anders spent most of 1942 taking part in commando raids against the Germans in the Channel Islands, but it was the success of Operation Postmaster that got both him and SOE noticed back home. It bought the new organisation breathing space while its hopes of stirring up trouble in occupied Europe were yet to come to fruition, and it earned Lassen a promotion and a medal. The Dane was on his way to becoming the epitome of the hunter class of commandos Churchill had imagined. Lassen's military cross was accompanied by a citation, signed by Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations, with a note that it was of no account to be published. On 12th of December 1942, 5 days after the award, Anders' brother, Frans, touched down at RAF Lucas in Scotland aboard a courier flight from Stockholm. After serving for 18 months with the Danish Army's Lifeguards Regiment, Frans lived off a small bag of Marie biscuits for 8 days while hidden in the hold of a small ship before finally getting ashore in Gothenburg with a borrowed passport. Arrested and gallowed by the Swedish police in Stockholm, it looked as if he too would be returned to Copenhagen. But as the tide of war began to change, Sweden's previously rigid approach to the neutrality began to blow in the Allies' direction, and he was released after a few months in custody. After announcing his intention to fight to the British Embassy, he was soon climbing out of Stockholm's Bromma Airport in the back of a BOAC Lockheed Hudson for the perilous journey to Scotland through skies patrolled by German night fighters. Frans was reunited with his brother on Christmas Eve over lunch at the Danish Embassy in London. Anders had already helped steer his brother in the direction of Room 98, Horse Guards, the cover address for SOE's special training schools. 4 days later, Anders would receive an emergency commission into the British Army from Combined Ops HQ. In the new year, he'd be joining Frans in SOE's small-scale raiding force, 62 Commando, but for now, the brothers caught up on news of family and friends. The conversation turned to their cousin Axel fighting for Germany. He'd been shot in the lung by a Russian sniper in 1941, but had recovered to return to his unit on the Eastern Front. Anders and Frans bore him no personal animosity. nor did they know anything of what their cousin had borne witness to just 2 months earlier. After taking part in the assault on Poland in 1939, then slicing through Western Europe in the Blitzkrieg of spring 1940, the war had, by October 1942, brought Captain Axel von Dumbusch to Ukraine. His unit, Infantry Regiment 9 of Potsdam, was part of a long, proud, and principled Prussian military tradition that could feel anachronistic in the service of the Third Reich, but still only 23 years old. Axel tried not to dwell on the ugliness of the regime, focusing instead on doing his duty to his unit and trying to live up to the standards set by those who'd served the 9th before him. But in Dubno, 200 miles west of Ukraine's capital Kiev, the young officer was confronted with the full horror of the Nazis for the first time. Ordered to set up a cordon sanitaire around a disused airfield for the SS, he saw a miles-long queue of women, men, children and babies standing naked in the autumn sunshine, their clothes laid out in neat piles separated into shoes, overgarments and underwear, ready to be loaded onto lorries and taken away. Watched over by SS guards with horsewhips, the wretched line of people stood, waiting their turn to be ushered towards large pits dug deep into the ground. 6-foot-high heaps of topsoil sat alongside them. Dubno's Jews had been forced to dig their own graves. For 2 days, in batches of 20 or so, families and friends were then made to climb down onto the backs of the dead and dying, ready to be shot in the nape of the neck to form a fresh layer of bodies. Von den Busch pleading with his commanding officer to give the order for his men to intervene to stop the genocide, but he refused, telling his young adjutant that if he did, then he and all of his officers would be shot for treason. After this, both of them knew that Infantry Regiment 9 would never be the same again, nor would any of the men who saw it. Thousands of Jews were killed in the massacre. Axel was so horrified by it that he would regret not joining the queue himself. He knew, though, that if he was going to be able to cling on to his own honour and self-esteem, he had to make a choice: to die in battle, to desert, or to go to war against the Third Reich. He chose the last of these options. The Führer, he was in no doubt, had forfeited any claim to allegiance and should be eliminated. Once back in Germany, Axel began making the first tentative approaches to fellow officers he believed might be sympathetic to his cause. In London, his cousins, Anders and Franz, discussed their own hatred of the same regime. Every time I heard Dr. Goebbels yelling on the radio, Franz felt the same cold anger and fury he knew burned through his brother. To be sure of avoiding it, the Danish brothers were going to have to be careful not to be anywhere near a wireless in the month's time, for 30th of January 1943 marked the 10th anniversary of the Nazis' accession to power in Germany, and Joseph Goebbels had plans to celebrate it in style with patriotic speeches broadcast to the nation and the whole world. The Royal Air Force took the same dim view of allowing Goebbels and his cronies to enjoy uninterrupted airtime, and happily they, at least, were in a position to do something about it. Well, that's the end of chapter 4. So I'll carry on with chapter 5. Seems to be getting quite deep, doesn't it? But really enjoyable book so far. Hope you're enjoying it with me, and will join me for chapter 5 in the next recording of The Mosquito. Thank you.